So we cover a lot of ground. We're not necessarily going to get out to visit you tomorrow, but we love what we do. We're happy to talk to you on the phone, and we will come out and visit everyone that contacts us. It might just take us a while. So today we're going to talk about selecting and planting forest seedlings. On the screen there, you got two pictures from DNR's Webster Nursery. Over there on the left, a nice sunny day, probably in the summertime. On the right, a cooler winter's day, and you can see that those seedlings are all iced over. And they do that intentionally when they are going to get extreme cold, especially if it's at a time of year that maybe is weird for extreme cold, like early November or maybe going into March. The trees may not be hardened off for that. They may not be expecting it. And so they actually run the sprinklers overnight and they put this layer of ice on them to freeze them over. And that actually protects them from frost damage. So what we're going to cover today, we are going to cover a little bit of site prep for those of you that were on my talk last week. It's going to be a lot of review. It's only going to be about 10-15 minutes of it. The bulk of what we're going to talk about, 40 minutes or so, is going to be about tree planting. So after site prep, we're going to talk about what to plant, stock types, and how to plant. So first, what we're going to talk about again is site prep. So why do we need to site prep? Well, for those of you that were in the talk last week, you already know, and for those of you that are new this week, brush grows really fast, and the first couple of seasons of a tree's life are the most difficult. Think about it. So trees are in a nursery, they're nice and happy, nice controlled environment, relatively controlled anyways. They get lifted, they get thrown in a bag, they get thrown in a cooler, they get thrown in the back of your truck, and then they get thrown out in the woods where you plant them. That's a very stressful thing for trees. So that first year, they're practically in shock and they just kind of hang out and they're just getting used to the site. The second year, they might put on a little bit of root and shoot growth. Really, if you're lucky in those first 2 years to get a foot of growth off of a tree, you should consider yourself lucky. Meanwhile, brush grows really fast, as we all know. Scotch broom several feet, blackberries 6 feet or more. These brush species will outcompete your trees, especially in those first 2 years. Think about the shade tolerance of a lot of the trees that we plant. A lot of our pioneer species that a lot of landowners like to plant, red alder, pines, Douglas fir, they're all pretty shade intolerant and they're not going to probably survive being over top for very long. Or if they do, they're not going to be very vigorous seedlings. They may not respond well to release. And then think about the time and money that you put in to your tree planting effort, right? So if you're planting it yourself, you're putting in a lot of time. If you're managing a contract, you're still putting in a lot of time. You're certainly, no matter what you do, whether you plant it yourself or hire a contractor, putting in a lot of money. And we want to make sure that that's a good investment. And so starting with that site prep is a good way to make sure your trees get off on the right foot. But isn't brush critical for a fully functioning forest ecosystem? It sure is. So it's not that brush or shrub vegetation is bad, but it does want to outcompete your trees, and many times it is. Certainly, if we're talking about invasive vegetation, there's really no place for it at all. But even native vegetation can cause problems for newly established seedlings, and so we can introduce brush into the system later, or you can make sure you plan where the brush is so that's not competing with your trees. Make sure it stays low for the time being until your trees get up. So again, not that all brush or vegetation is bad, but just know that for those first couple of years, it's going to be a pretty competitive environment. So with our site prep, our purpose is right there. We want to create plantable spots and minimize competition. So when I talk about site prep, I'm also going to be talking about slash management as well as vegetation management. Vegetation management and slash management could both be chemical or mechanical and fire. And then chemical, we're going to be talking about vegetation management. So before I move on, looking at this slide, this is a pretty slashy unit we have here. If you look in the bottom right, a little bit of green coming up. So there might be a few places where there's some plantable spots, but I think there's going to be some places where you just can't get to the ground in this spot here, and so we're going to be losing plantable spots. We're not going to be able to plant it as dense maybe as we wanted, and then certainly we have a fire hazard maybe for several years with this type of fuel loading, even in Western Washington. So this is an example of something we might want to do a little bit of slash management on. So a couple of ways that we can do it. So we talked about burning over there on the left in the slide. You can see there's a pile burning. There's one up on the hill in the background too. So this can be a good way to manage slash, but you don't have to burn. So managing slash, you could do it like you on like the slide you see on the right. In this slide here, they left a fair amount of slash throughout the unit. Slash is good for your trees. It can do several things like provide microsites where we have a lower soil temperature, higher soil moisture, which is really good for trees. And then as it decomposes, it's going to add nutrients back into the soil. So slash is good, and I don't recommend getting rid of all the slash. We just need to manage it in such a way that we can make sure trees are in the ground and successful. You can see in the back of this picture here on the right that there's at least 3 piles that I can see there. So what they did in this picture, instead of burning it, is they just made several small piles throughout the unit, which can provide some wildlife habitat and again decompose. And they made them small enough so that we're not losing too many plantable spots with our slash piles. So on the right, I would consider that a picture of good slash management. And those trees looks like they might have had a little bit of browse on them, but for the most part, I think those trees look pretty happy in that picture. You can certainly do too much though, and it's important to keep that in mind. So this picture here was done for forestry purposes, not for any sort of conversion to another land use. They popped stumps, which is not something you see very often in forestry. They ran that cat all up and down the unit. They probably compacted the soil, so we're going to have less water infiltration, maybe a little bit more soil runoff. Compaction in and of itself can be a pretty bad thing for trees. It makes it more difficult growing environment for trees. And then their piles burned pretty hot. They had pretty large piles in this unit, and you can see the pink in the pictures on the left or the right of the dozer there. And that means that it burned really hot, and it's going to be really hard for water to penetrate through those areas, and the trees aren't likely to survive if you plant in those areas. So in this case, they probably reduced site productivity on this unit, which is something that we're trying to avoid. So getting into a little bit of vegetation management with site prep, we have the Pacific Northwest, or sorry, chemical site prep, vegetation management. We have the Pacific Northwest Weed Management Handbook, and we have a link that you can see there. That has a lot of good information if you're thinking about using chemicals to control some of the vegetation on your site prior to tree planting. You can put in the particular species that you're looking for, and then with that, it'll tell you the different chemicals you can use, the rates of the chemicals that you can use, the time of year to use it at. So it can be a really good resource for you if you're thinking about using chemical. Make sure whatever you use is labeled for the site. Make sure it's forestry use or forest land use. And remember that the label is the law. So when you're reading that, it's going to tell you what you can use it on. It's going to tell you where you can use it. And that's the law. And so we want to make sure that we're following that the best we can. Often when we're talking about site prep, we don't have trees to worry about, but if we have trees, we want to make sure they're protected. Conifers are more at risk for damage from chemicals during the growing season, especially when lush new growth is on the trees. So we want to make sure we're using some sort of barrier or something like that to protect the trees from drift. Um, so Keith asked a question, the best way to prep individual sites to transplant evergreens, fir, spruce, larch in clay soils. Keith, are you in Eastern Washington or Western Washington? And while I wait for you to answer that, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So here's an example of chemical site prep on the left and on the right. I'll start on the right. On the right, this was 6 years post-harvest. They were hoping to take advantage of some advanced cedar regeneration, and the cedar regeneration didn't take, but what did take is a lot of blackberry, scotch broom, and grasses. And at this point, this would be considered a failure, the plantation, and we'd have to go back through and essentially start over, and we've lost 6 years of time growing trees. Over on the left, that is an example of some pretty decent site prep. This is about 4 years post-harvest. The trees are getting browsed. You can see they look kind of bushy, and so they are struggling to get a little bit of height on them. And there's some grass coming in. It looks pretty thick, and it was moderately thick when I was out there, but there's still a lot of patches of bare dirt in there. And the yellow you see in the picture is Scotch broom. And there's not a lot in there, which is really good because just across the street from me, there was a whole unit of Scotch broom. So the seed bed is definitely around. Um, so this site prep is working really well at this point, and if these trees can get above the brows, I think they're going to start to take off here pretty soon. So this is kind of what we're looking for, trying to get something closer to the right than the left. So Keith, you're up in Ponderay County. You know, the processes are going to be the same. If you don't have trees in the property already, we're going to want to uh, prep the site with however means you want. Depends what you have. It might be mechanical, it might be chemical, it might be some hand pulling. I would recommend that you get in touch with Rob Leinberger because it's probably going to be site specific for you. And I'm not going to get into site prep very much because this is a reforestation class. And so I'm just giving a brief overview. So Rob's contact information will be up at the end, and I would get a hold of him to get more specific information about your site prep questions. Um, so remember, it's all about giving these trees a good head start. And on the left, I think they got a pretty good head start. On the right, they weren't given much of a head start, and the lack of reforestation I saw in there kind of shows that. So last slide on site prep before we start getting into reforestation. So if you don't want to burn or can't burn, if you don't want to use chemicals, then you're down to either mechanical means or good old fashioned elbow grease. If it's really bad, you'll probably want to start out using something like a brush hog, which is what's down in the bottom right. That's a skid steer with basically a big brush hog or brush mower attachment on the front. If you have trees that you're looking to save, this isn't a very good option because you're not going to see the trees very well. But if you have 6 and 8 foot tall blackberries like what you see in there, it may be a good option for you to start. Even if you're not chemical averse and you want to use chemicals, those blackberries are probably too high for it to be very effective at this point. So you're going to have to do something first before you can even use chemicals if you want to. So the skid steer, like you see on the right, on the bottom left, that's a guy with a brush saw. It's basically a weed whacker with a circular saw on it, and he's going to town on those blackberries down there. So that's another option that you have for yourself to help kind of get you back down to a baseline where you can start managing it a little bit better. For certain species like Scotch broom, that weed wrench can work really well. Um, and it's a good way to pull out some of the vegetation that you have there. You do have to watch out for creating a little bit more of a seed bed. But honestly, with these methods, follow up care is going to have to occur. So even though you're going to create a little bit of a seed bed, there was probably nothing you were going to do that was going to prevent you from having to come back and check it out, anyways. So these methods can be effective. They just take a little bit of work and a little bit of follow up care. When you're pulling, try to pull things when they're small and young, hopefully before we have the root system develop, if you can, to try to avoid getting the situation like you see on these slides here. Always try to remove as much of the root as possible, limit the soil disturbance, like I said, which can be difficult, and then be prepared to follow up with a little bit of additional work. Okay. So now we're getting into what you all came for, which is reforestation. And I do want to mention that the reason why I talked about that site prep again is because if your reforestation efforts are going to be successful, getting your trees off to the right start is critical to making sure that happens. So don't discount that site prep stuff, even though it was a relatively small portion of this presentation. So two types of reforestation, artificial and natural. The bulk of this is going to focus on artificial. So I'm just going to touch on natural real quick right now, and then I'll be talking about artificial regeneration for the rest of the time. So with natural regeneration, basically you get what you get. You're basically at the whim of nature, the tree species that are around. You get the stalking that nature gives you. It's typically patchy in nature, so you get a lot of trees over there, a few trees over here. If you're going to do it, plan your harvest accordingly. If you're planning on using natural regeneration after a harvest, let the logger know so that they can scarify as much as possible if you're looking for Douglas fir or alder regeneration. Both of those species like bare mineral soil to regenerate on. And you may need to leave a little bit more organic material around if you're hoping for hemlock or cedar regeneration, which quite honestly, I don't recommend because I don't think that you get a lot of natural seeding, at least in clear cut units with those. Know the prevailing wind direction so that you can leave scattered trees upwind so that those seeds get blown down into the unit. And then make sure you're choosing your leaf trees wisely. Good quality trees, well formed, little or no defect, so that you're getting good quality trees into the unit as it starts to reseed. Lots of risk with this proposition. You really got to stay up on your site prep. And if you're going to use chemicals, you really got to watch what you use so that you don't inhibit seedling growth, as well as your other plant growth. So lots of risk, and there's very few instances where it's probably the best bet. For the most part, I think artificial regeneration is going to be the way to go. You typically get superior genetic stock with artificial regeneration. Even if you are getting what's called woods run, when they just go out and collect seed from the woods and bring it in and grow it in a nursery, they're looking for good quality trees when they're collecting that woods run seed. And so you still get a pretty decent tree. Excuse me, you still get a pretty decent tree out of it. You're able to control the species and the density pretty good. You can plant what you want. You can plant where you want to plant it. You can take advantage of those microsites, kind of like you see in that picture. We've already seen it once, but over there on the left, you can see in the tree in the foreground is planted right next to some slash and vegetation that's helping, like I mentioned, reduce soil temperatures, increase soil moisture, a little bit of nutrients as it decomposes. So that's a pretty good spot to plant trees. And you're able to take advantage of that when you do artificial regeneration. And again, we're going to be focusing on artificial regeneration for the bulk of this presentation. So as I've mentioned, reforestation, we're at a critical stage here. Those first few years of life are especially hard, though it can vary depending on the site. Sometimes it can be much longer than a couple of years. The environment at soil level is a harsh place. Um, Wild temperature swings, cold at night, warm during the day. It's often dry, especially during the growing season here in the Pacific Northwest, or even on a normal year, it's pretty dry. So, doing the good site prep, like what we see in this photo, is just the first start. And just like we've seen already, light to moderate slash, really good for the soil and the trees, plantable spots, a little brush pile up on the hill. Um, they actually also did what's called a pre-emergent chemical spray on this, where they sprayed bare dirt to inhibit vegetation growth. And these seedlings are going to basically have all the nutrients, the light, water, and nutrients on the site available to them. So doing good site prep, like in the pictures, is the first step. But once you've committed to planted trees, we need to pick the right trees to help build on the good site prep that you've hopefully done. And that's what we're basically going to talk about for the rest of the presentation here. So we've decided to plant trees. It doesn't quite matter what tree you want to plant. We still need to source it from the proper location. So what we have here is this is an example of a seed zone map. And you can see that publication that I have the link up there at the top. That has a link to not only Douglas fir, which is a seed zone map that we're looking at here, but a whole bunch of other tree species in that occur in Washington. And what this is saying is that within one of these seed zones, so let's just take the Kitsap seed zone in the middle. You can see where it says Kitsap 5. So within that zone, the climate, the topography is roughly similar, and the tree genetics are roughly similar. So if you wanted to plant in, say, Kitsap County somewhere, the appropriate tree to get to plant in your area would come from that Kitsap seed zone. And so when you call a nursery and you say, hey, I want to plant Douglas fir, I'm up in Kitsap County, they say, oh, okay, I have some trees that were grown from the Kitsap seed zone to give you. If they don't tell you where the seedlings have come from, or if they don't ask you where you're planting it from, I would clarify that you are getting the appropriate tree. And if you don't think you are, I would go to another nursery, because offsite tree planting, we know it causes problems. And so we want to make sure that we're getting the right tree from the right seed zone. But what about climate change? So we know things are getting warmer and drier, and the question often arises, Should we get a tree from a seed zone that we're in, or should we look elsewhere? And I have to say that it's difficult for us to give some solid advice on that, but we do have some information about that. So what we know is you have those green lines, which is what you should focus on this map. Those green lines are the seed zone boundaries, the current seed zone boundaries. And we know that it's a sliding scale and not an abrupt edge. So what I mean is that once you get to the line between Kitsap and Lower Columbia, let's say, or any other seed zone, it's not that boom, all of a sudden the climate has changed significantly, the topography has changed significantly, or the tree genetics changed immediately after you get to that line. It kind of changes slowly over time, and that line that they drew on there is somewhat arbitrary in nature. So you can, especially if you're near a boundary of one of those seed zones, it can be pretty forgiving if you get it from one seed zone or another. We also know that trees tend to be somewhat forgiving moving in latitude. That means north south, but less so when we're moving in elevation up down or in longitude east west. So, what that means is if we're looking to plant our tree in Kitsap County and we're worried about it getting warmer and drier over time, maybe we look to the Toutle or the Lower Columbia seed zones that are just south of Kitsap, but maybe we don't want to get it from Ponderay or Kettle, even though those might be warmer environments. Moving it from the east over to the west side, probably that tree is not going to do well. And we do have examples where we have taken trees from eastern parts of the state, Oregon, Washington, and moved them to Western Washington, and they don't do well. So we know that this is true. We've seen it happen. So look one seed zone south, maybe if you're worried about climate change. I'd give you a little bit of caution about moving too much further south than one seed zone at this time. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through this presentation. Did see a question from Jeff Larson saying, "Can you speak to burned areas, no slash?" So yeah, if you've burned and you've lost a lot of your slash, I don't know again if this is Eastern Washington or Western Washington. If it was a really hot fire, some fertilization might be needed if it really burned the soil. Um, if if it wasn't that hot, then you might actually get some benefit from the fire. The biggest thing that you may have to worry about there is going to be vegetation coming up and having to manage the other vegetation as you get trees. If you're in Eastern Washington, I again would talk to Rob Leinberger. His contact information will come up on the screen again at the end of this presentation. He's been in fire for a long time. He knows it very well. He's done restoration type work, and I think he can give you some solid advice, more so than I could probably give you. So, what about this concept of assisted migration? So, for those of you that have been to several of these presentations, you might recognize this slide if you went to Dave Peterson's climate change presentation back in May, where he pondered this concept of assisted migration, which is a concept of moving trees from one area to another where we think the climate might be similar in the future. So this isn't taking Douglas fir from a seed zone south and moving it up per se. This is actually taking different tree species and moving them outside of their range to an area where we think it might be similar. So common ones that I hear a lot about are sequoia and redwood. Also pictured in this slide is incense cedar on the left and white fir in the middle. White fir not being grand fir, but a different tree called white fir that grows in Oregon. And again, it's hard for us to give really solid recommendations on this. I personally am not a fan of assisted migration, moving other tree species up. As a stewardship forester, I like the native tree species. We don't always know how different species are going to grow and react when they're planted outside of their range. Many times they don't do very well. Sometimes, like in the case of Tree of Heaven or Paulownia, they can outcompete our native trees. So whether they do poorly or do so well, they outcompete our native trees. Neither one of those are really good, right? We don't want to see either one of those. So there's a lot of risk in this undertaking of moving different species from one area to another. In my opinion, maybe a more appropriate solution is to consider where we source our trees from, like we talked about in the different slide in the previous slide. For instance, Douglas fir, it has a range that spans from British Columbia all the way down to Mexico. So the odds that we can't find an appropriate seed source for the next several years, several decades for Douglas fir are probably pretty low because it's adapted to such a wide range of climates. Western red cedar, western hemlock have ranges that extend down into California. So the tree species that we have in Western Washington have some pretty wide ranges. And I think maybe a more appropriate answer is to look at where we get our native trees from as opposed to bringing up new tree species. And Simon mentioned that white firs repeatedly failed in parks in Tacoma. And so that, that doesn't always happen, but that's the risk, is that the trees that you plant just don't do well. So, again, looking at assisted migration and some of the concerns that we have and trying to give good advice on what things are going to look like in the future, is this slide here from Dr. Jessica Holofsky from UW in the Pacific Northwest Research Station. She gave this presentation back last September for the Tree Farm program. And what this is showing, so RCP 4.5 and 8.5, you can think of those as different levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which roughly correlate to different levels of temperature change. So you can see where we are right about 2020, things have been going up. And as you follow the lines, up until about 2050, things are pretty similar, whether you have the 8.5, which is the more carbon dioxide, or if we take steps to reduce our carbon footprint and we reduce the carbon dioxide, which would be the blue line. So they're pretty similar up until about 2050. Then after 2050, they really start to diverge wildly. So one of the challenges we have about giving landowners advice about what's going to be around in 2100 per se, which is the end of this chart, is that if we do some global cooperation, if we reduce our carbon footprint, then maybe we're going to see about a 6-degree Fahrenheit change in temperature. If we do nothing and things continue as they're going, then maybe we're going to see closer to a 12-degree Fahrenheit change in temperature. And that's a very significant change for trees. And so, depending on what end of the spectrum we are, uh, some trees will do better than others. So again, this is just something for you to consider when you're thinking about trees into the future, is that there's a lot of uncertainty here. We know temperatures are going to increase, but we don't necessarily know how much, because how much depends on the actions that we take and how much directly impacts the trees that can grow and how they'll grow. Another option for you when you're trying to decide where to get your seedlings from is this seed lot selection tool. So you got the website right there, and this is a web-based mapping application that is designed to help natural resource managers and landowners like yourselves match seed lots with specific planting sites based on climatic information. So this is mostly, again, based on climatic information and doesn't really take into account any site-specific information. So you do have to take this with a grain of salt to some degree. Um, it's not 100% accurate, but it's a tool that you can use. What I've done here is I was looking at Douglas fir, and I was going to plant my Douglas fir trees down in Clark County. And I wanted them to live through 2070, which would be about a 50-year-old tree. So I was thinking about one rotation. And I assumed that we were going to have some excellent global cooperation and we were going to be at that RCP of about 4.5. And what this did is it told me where I should source my Douglas fir seedlings from. And you can see a lot of it is California at this point, looking out towards 2070. Again, you got to take this with a grain of salt, because if I was to go down to California to grab those trees and try to plant it today, they may not do very well for the next several decades, right? Because it's going to be a while before we get to those higher temperatures. Um, so this is a tool, and you got to take it with a grain of salt. You also see that there is some areas in Southern Oregon where I could get those seeds from as well. So maybe that's a better option to grab my Douglas fir seedlings in this scenario. Takes a little bit of getting used to use this tool, but go ahead, log on after this, play around with it, and you'll kind of get the gist of it. It's got a lot of different climate scenarios that you can kind of look at. So we talked a little bit about where to get our seedling from. So now we have a slide here on what we should plant based on our site-specific conditions. So what this slide is trying to demonstrate is matching the species to your site condition. So across the top, we have our tree species on the left, and then we have 5 different site conditions: shade, whether you have wet soils, dry soils, or droughty soils, prone to frost, and then how much browse you have. You could add to the list diseases, insects, things like that, right? So this isn't a comprehensive list, but it has a lot of the different factors that we may see in soils, so or in sites. So let's start up at red alder. We're not going to go through all of these, but I'll go through a couple of choice ones and walk you through it. So red alder, if we look, shade is a 1. Down at the bottom, you can see that 1 is least tolerant. So what this is telling you is that least tolerant alder has very little tolerance for shade. So if you have a shady site, it's probably not appropriate to plant red alder. Wet soils has a 3, so it can do pretty good in wet soils. It can't have flooded soils, but if you have maybe a high winter water table or something like that, alder can do pretty good. Doesn't do very well in drought or droughty soils. Doesn't tolerate frost very well. Alder's known for getting frost check and straight up dying from frost, especially when it's young. And then it can get browsed pretty heavily. With browse, what you want to look at with a 1, meaning least tolerant, means that it is most likely to get browsed. Um, so lower the number, higher likelihood something's going to eat it. As we go down the list here, the 4th one down is Douglas fir. So shade 2, right? So maybe it can tolerate a little bit more shade than alder, but still it's pretty shade intolerant. Wet soils a 2, doesn't like wet soils very well. Drought 3. So Douglas fir is fairly drought hardy. We've seen some drought mortality over the last few years, but it does pretty good in some droughty conditions. Can tolerate frost to a fair amount. It's got a 3 rating there, and then a browse as a 2. So Douglas fir is also going to get browsed pretty substantially. If we go down to the second from the bottom, Western red cedar, shade is a 5. So it can tolerate some really shady conditions. I do want to point out that with shade, things like Western red cedar, Western hemlock, Pacific silver fir that have a 5 for shade, what this means is if they grow in shady environments, they're not necessarily going to die. It doesn't mean that you're going to get a lot of growth if they're growing in shady environments. Sooner or later, these trees would have to be released to get a little bit of sun in order for them to grow substantially. But if you had a shady environment, one of the things that I see some landowners do is they have a degraded alder forest. They know sometime in the future they're going to have to cut red alder. They don't want to have a complete clear cut. So what they do is they plant Western red cedar in the understory, and then they come back and plant. And then when they harvest their alder, the hope is that some of that red alder survive, or some of the Western red cedar survives, and they have a forest to start from. So again, you're going to get a copy of this presentation. And so you're going to have this slide. And so you can consider your site conditions, take a look at this, and start to decide what trees are good and what trees maybe are not so good for your site. Your objectives are also going to factor in as well. So if you have a timber management objective, some of these species aren't very good for that. Black cottonwood doesn't have a lot of economic value. Lodgepole pine doesn't have a lot of economic value. Oregon ash, Oregon white oak, not a lot of economic value. So your objectives and the environment is what's going to help you make a good decision. And again, myself or Rob Lineberger in Eastern Washington are happy to come out and talk to you about that and help you assess your condition, your objectives, and figure out what's good to plant in your site. Again, thinking about climate change and low soil moisture, here are some trees that can tolerate low soil moisture is pretty good. So I'll let you guys look at that for a sec. Andrew asked a question, do I have any information about chestnut trees? I got to tell you, not a whole lot. It's not something that gets planted over here very often. When a lot of people are talking about some mass producing tree, I tend to hear walnuts a lot more. Again, being a stewardship forester working in Washington, I tend to focus on our native tree species. So I am not a huge fan of planting walnuts or chestnuts or anything like that. We don't have a lot of chestnut blight out here if you're talking about the American chestnut. And so they might do okay. In fact, I'm pretty sure the champion chestnut tree in the country is over in the Tri Cities or something like that. I don't know if Brendan or Kevin want to chime in on the chat box or something like that with some more information on chestnut. So we've talked about where to get our trees. We've talked about matching the tree species to the site. So now we're going to talk about stock type. Trees are grown in different ways in a nursery, and each way that they grow a tree has its pluses and minuses, and that's basically what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes here. So looking at the prices, just because I have it in my notes here before I keep going to talk to these more specific ones, we're going to talk about why these might be more or less expensive. For the 2019-2020 prices at Webster Nursery, the 2 O's were the cheapest at 65 cents a tree. And then the price got reduced once we got over 100 trees. The 1 1s were about 92 cents a tree, and then the plugs were about $1.14 a tree. And again, that'll make more sense to you as we go through here. So let's dig into each one of these and talk about them a little bit, the pluses and minuses. So plugs. So plugs are grown in a container in a greenhouse. They call them styrofoam containers. The common sizes are Styro 2 and Styro 10. That basically is analogous to the cubic inches. So Styro 2, 2 cubic inches, Styro 10, 10 cubic inches. So the Styro 10s are the bigger tree. Styro 2s are the smaller tree. So these are a seedling that are grown again in the greenhouse in containers that are relatively narrow and deep. So because they're in this greenhouse controlled environment, pretty expensive to maintain greenhouses, put them up, climate control, everything else. That's part of the reason why they tend to be pretty expensive. They're a 1 year old tree, so the good thing about them is that they can be quickly produced, especially important for maybe large landowners that may end up having to deal with a blowdown event or some other unforeseen event and they need trees all suddenly. They can be really good for some rocky or harsh sites because they are relatively narrow. Dry sites they can be really good in. As an example, last year in 2019, we were doing the Buckley coached planning over in Pierce County, and we went to our site and we had a clear cut that we looked at, and there were several dead trees and several live trees on this site, and they had just been planted a few months prior to that. So I took the class around and we dug up several trees, and every tree that we dug up that was dead was some sort of bare root tree, and every tree that we dug up was alive was a plug, and there were zero exceptions to that. Every dead tree we dug up was a bare root. And that site was really dry and rocky, and so the plugs allowed those trees to have a little bit of a microsite. That vermiculite is what it's called. I say it's roughly analogous to potting soil, and it basically gave the tree a little bit of a microsite where it was able to survive that rocky, harsh condition. The downfall is they're a small tree. If you have a lot of brush competition, if you have a lot of animal browse, these are small trees that are going to take a little while to get up above that brush. So you got to consider that as well, and make sure you do some good site prep and uh, protect them in some way if you have a lot of animals out there that like to eat trees. So moving to the next one, we have the plug one. So this is a 2 year tree in the nursery for a year, and then it gets outplanted to the nursery bed at approximately 6 inches per square foot for another year. The roots get pruned when they pull it out of the styrofoam container and put it out in the field. This stimulates a little bit of root growth, and the fact that they're giving a little bit more space when they're in that nursery bed helps them get a little bit more caliper, which is the diameter of that tree right at the root collar, so where the roots and the stem start. So it gets a little bit thicker there, and those trees get a little bit taller. So these trees again are a little bit more expensive because they're a 2 year old tree, but they're a little bit bigger, a little bit more stout tree. Every one that I've seen still has a little bit of that vermiculite attached to them, even though they've been outplanted. So they still have that going for them. It's not as much as when they're in a plug, but they still have a little bit of the microclimate. They have a bigger root system, but it's not huge. So it can go in some of the same harsher sites and will probably do okay. Some tree species like cedar, hemlock, larch, they just tend to do better like this. So at least a Webster nursery tends to grow these and for those particular species. Moving on to the 1-1. So 1-1 means it was grown for a year out in a seed bed. They lift it, they do a little bit of root pruning, and then they stick it back in the ground at a little bit wider spacing and grow it for another year. And much like the plug one, the root pruning stimulates the root growth, and then the little bit wider spacing the second year allows them to capture a lot more of the light water nutrients. So they get a little bit additional height growth as well as a little bit additional caliper growth. So these are really good stout trees. They can do really good on infertile sites because they have a lot of root mass. They can compete pretty well with other vegetation because of that root mass. And these trees are a pretty tall tree. This picture doesn't really do them justice on how tall they can be. So they can have a better shot at surviving browse damage than some of the other trees that we've talked about can because they are a little bit taller. Then you have the workhorse, the 2.0. Basically, this is planted, grown for 2 years, lifted, and sold to you. So there's not a lot of handling to it. It's not in a greenhouse, it's out in the fields. And so, because of that, the costs are a lot lower on these. So, that's a lot of why people get them because if we're talking about planting tens of acres, that can be pretty significant cost wise. So, these are a good low cost tree because they're never replanted at a wider spacing and the roots are never pruned, they don't tend to get the big root mass. If you look at the root mass between this 1-1 and this 2.0, you can see how much darker and more fibrous this root mass is here versus the 2.0. So the 1-1 has a lot more roots in order to capture a lot more nutrients in this 2.0. And what the pictures don't show between the two is the 1-1s are typically 6 inches to a foot taller than the 2.0. So same amount of years grown, but because of how the 1-1 is grown, it's a taller tree with more roots, but it costs you more, right? So there's a cost to getting that better tree. These are good for sites that are fair or better because of the low root mass with low competing vegetation and browse. So places where you've done some really good site prep and places where maybe the deer are either actively hunted or you're going to put a lot of protection into these seedlings to make sure that they're not browsed by the deer or the elk. And then these are pretty uncommon. The DNR used these a few years ago. Haven't seen them too much recently, so I've been thinking about getting rid of this slide, but quite haven't yet. This is the 2-1 with the DNR used to call the browse busters. Grown for 2 years out in the field. They lift it up, they do the root pruning, they stick it back in the ground, they grow it for another year. So this is a 3-year-old tree. Much like the 1-1 with that root pruning, you get that nice solid root mass, and you have, because it's a 3-year-old tree, a really tall tree. You still need to plant these on good sites though. So these were designed for areas with a lot of browse, so they were a taller tree to get above that browse quick. But even though they were root pruned and have a decent root mass, they were still a really tall tree, and still those roots would struggle to provide the nutrients required to that tree on some of the poorer sites. Again, not something you're going to see too often, but if you know you have a lot of browse problems, keep an eye out for like a 2-1 tree or a 3-year-old tree if you can, and you might have a better chance of getting those above the browse. So moving on to density. So how much should we plant? So it's really going to depend on your objectives. Industry standard, I would say, is that 10 to 12 foot spacing. So 303 to about 431 trees per acre. If you're going to plant red alder, we typically go to 9 or 8 foot spacing. The goal with alder typically is to grow nice, straight, clear veneer style wood. And when we plant trees a lot closer together, that tends to stimulate them to grow up quickly to try and get above each other. And then red alder, being relatively shade intolerant, sheds those lower branches with that competition. So we can get some nice, clear, straight wood. That also means you're going to have to do a little bit of earlier thinning, but that's for another presentation entirely. So, some considerations with your spacing. I just talked about the red alder versus conifer. Let's talk about some of your site conditions. If you have a lot of animal browse potential, you're going to want to plant some for the deer, basically. Just know the deer are going to kill some of your trees. So, we want to plant a little bit extra to make sure that we still get the stalking we're looking for. If you're going to have a lot of vegetative competition, natural, invasive, it doesn't really matter. We're going to want to plant more trees to it for two reasons. We're going to attempt to suppress the competing vegetation, but we're also going to hope that these trees are going to get above the vegetation because we know some of them are going to die. So basically, we're planting trees knowing we're going to get mortality and hoping the denser spacing also allows us to suppress some of that competition that's coming up. If we have drought prone soils, some of those harsher sites, we want to plant extra trees because we know we get a lot of mortality in those drought prone soils. Afforestation, if you are planting old pastures, old fields, lots of grass, grass is a really tough competitor for trees. That sod layer that grass can grow really pirates a lot of the water. So it's difficult for trees to grow in. They're compacted these areas a lot, so it's a really tough environment. Lots of mice, voles, rabbits, whatever else likes to chew on trees, live in these environments. So if you're trying some sort of afforestation activity, we would want to plant some extra trees in that area as well to ensure that we have survival. If you're an absentee landowner, so you only get to the property once a month, a few times a year, or something like that, where you're not going to be able to stay on top of issues because of that, that's another reason why we would want to plant on the higher level of densities, just to make sure that we get these trees out of the ground. We may have to thin some out later, if that's okay, as long as we can get them growing in the first place. So why do plantations fail? So there can be lots of reasons. I got some of the four big ones here. Unsuitable or poor quality planting stock. Remember when I was talking about your conversation with a nursery, if they don't ask you where you're planting, if they don't have an appropriate seed source to sell you, you want to go to a different place to get your seed source because offsite planting uh, can be very it can be devastating, really. Poor quality planting stock, that can be harder to identify, but make sure you look at the root mass on your trees and make sure it looks good. Make sure you have at least a little bit of fine roots. It is going to vary on the stock type you get. Look at the caliper, that diameter right at the root collar. Again, that's going to vary a little bit, but we want to make sure that it's a decent sized caliper for the height of the tree. Improper handling and storage. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. We're going to talk about that on the next slide, as you just saw. So I'm going to skip that one for now. And we'll talk about that in a sec. Competition for water and light by surrounding vegetation. So I spent the first 10 or 15 minutes talking about site prep. Reducing that stress by getting rid of the surrounding vegetation can be critical in ensuring that your trees that you've planted survive. And then animal damage, right? So doing anything you can to protect the trees so they can get above the browse. So seedling care. First, when do we want to plant? Typically in Western Washington, we're talking late fall into late spring. That is going to be different in Eastern Washington because you have snow on the ground and frozen soils. So I would give Rob Lineberger a call and ask him. I think sometimes they do some fall plantings before things freeze. Most of the time, I think they're doing their tree planting after the spring thaw. But Rob, for those of you in Eastern Washington, can give you some good site-specific information on planting in Eastern Washington. So here, typically, I'll tell landowners sometime around the first part of December, you can probably start planting trees. And for the most part, we can go into March. Sometimes you can go earlier or later, depending on the weather. Sometimes you can't plant within that window if we get warm spells, pineapple expresses, where temperatures get up into the mid 50s. That's too warm to be planting trees. Um, So we want to make sure that we are planting in the right window so that the trees have the best chance for success. We want to protect the trees from physical damage. We want to keep them moist at 90 to 95% humidity and cool 34 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you're not going to get all the trees in the ground, putting them under a tarp, under a shade tree, isn't typically good enough. If you do that for more than maybe one night, and I don't even know if that I'd recommend that, but I think some of the literature I read said that can be okay. You're asking yourself for problems. So try to only take what you can handle. Ask whatever nursery you plant from if you can leave trees in their tree cooler and plant what you can over time, and that'll help you out quite a bit. A couple of publications down there at the bottom for you to look at. Those have lots of information. They expand a lot more on what I was just talking about there, so you can go take a look at those and get additional information on making sure that your seedlings are well cared for before you even put them in the ground. Just a few more slides here. I know I'm at the 50-minute mark, so we're finishing up in a couple of minutes here. Um, so lots of ways to plant a tree incorrectly, only one way to plant a tree correctly. Down there in the bottom right, you can see a nice little happy, properly planted tree. The ones circled are the ones that we probably see the most when you're looking around at your trees. If you're seeing a lot of exposed roots like that, you're probably, you've planted them too shallow. Those roots are going to dry out. The L rooting and the J rooting is a common reason why trees die. Those roots never really straighten out and grow down. They kind of grow in the direction that they're facing. They don't get down to a point where they access a deeper soil moisture. And so over time, those trees tend to suffer and not do very well. If you're hiring a contractor, I would highly suggest that if you're not using consulting forester, you go behind the contractor and dig up a few trees and look for some of these problems, because you can't tell just by looking out at the field. Everything's going to look great, and then the first growing season or the second growing season, you're going to start to see mortality. Pamper, pamper, pamper. So I get asked about mulch and watering, things like that. So mulch can work really good, right? It can really help retain that soil moisture. The problem is if we're talking about large acreages, it's not very practical. So use some of those things I talked about, like the down wood and good slash management, to try to mimic what the mulch is offering you. If you're talking about just a few trees in your backyard or something like that, you can probably mulch them and it'd be okay. Make sure if you mulch, you don't mulch all the way to the stem of the tree. You want to give it a few inches of clear so that we don't have too much moisture near the tree that can bring in rot. Watering, again, can be effective, but not practical for a forested environment. Um, the big acreages, we're just not going to get it done. These trees have been around for thousands of years and haven't needed watering. I know the climate's changing, but again, it's not going to be practical in the long term. So if you have, again, a couple of yard trees that you want to water, slow, deep, and infrequent. We want to use like a drip hose. We want to make sure that the top foot of the soil, 12 inches, is getting water if possible. Use a probe, dig a hole, make sure the water's getting down there. And then, maybe once you've planted the tree, you're going to do it once a week or every couple of days. But over the long term, we're talking about once every couple of weeks that we would water these trees, right? We don't really want them getting used to it. And then reduce the stress, reduce the stress, reduce the stress. I can't say that enough, whether it's grass, whether it's animals, water, anything. Try to reduce the stress as much as possible. Just a few more slides here. Pamper, pamper, pamper. That's Ken Bevis on the left. He's talking to that ponderosa pine right there as well. So he was really proud of his trees he planted. You can use mulch mats and things like that you see on the right to try to pamper these seedlings. Again, if you have smaller acreages, it might work. If you got larger acreages, that gets impractical in a hurry. Two more slides. So this one is just my one slide on post-planting vegetation management. If you've spent the time to plant a lot of trees, the time, the money, the investment that you've put in, and then it gets to the point that we're looking at on the left, you can see I've circled a Douglas fir tree there. Not going to be those trees aren't going to respond very well if we go in and cut those alders and release that tree. So we may have wasted our time and money at this point if we let it get to this point. So just remember to keep up on the vegetation management. The picture on the right, yeah, we might have been able to release that one, but it's still going to take us a lot of time and money at this point. So just keep up on that vegetation management as much as possible, and I think you'll be better off there. So, just to recap real quick, get your trees from the right spot, match your species and the stock type to your site, and a forester like myself is happy to come out and help you figure that out. Ensure that your trees are planted properly. I'm not sure if I mentioned reducing stress, so I'm going to say it again. Reduce the stress on your trees. And remember that you can't just walk away. And that's John Troba in that picture there. He's the longtime DNR Webster Nursery seedling manager, and he knows his seedlings. And with that, my contact information and Rob's on the east side, and I'll pass it back over to Kevin so we can start answering some questions.
All right, thanks, Matt. We have a question. Is fresh pine mulch discouraged for tree growth? I have heard some people say it's not a good idea, and others say there's no evidence it really matters.
I've heard that it's acidic is the pine. And a lot of the trees in Western Washington, feel free to chime in, Kevin, but I feel they can deal with acidic environments really well. Douglas fir in particular can grow in some pretty acidic environments. So I personally don't think it matters if you're going to mulch the type of mulch you get, but I don't know if you have any thoughts, Kevin.
Our native soils are known for being relatively acidic.
Yep.
So if it's just an acidic issue, it's probably not going to be a huge deal.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Whoa, that was the only question. We're getting off easy.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
Post-planting care, is it okay to use herbicide around 2 to 3-year-old seedlings?
So the short answer is yes. The longer answer is you need to watch out what you use to make sure it's not going to burn the seedlings. You need to watch the time of year you do it on, and it's probably a good idea to use some sort of barrier, regardless of what the label says for damaging the tree. So I know a little bit about herbicides, but I wouldn't call myself an expert. But there are some chemicals that you can spray, quote unquote, over the top of conifer seedlings in particular that aren't supposed to burn them. So wherever you would buy your herbicides, the farm store, for instance, you could talk to the dealer manager on site and they could probably give you some good information. But yes, you can use herbicides around 2 to 3-year-old trees.
I would add to that, don't think that just because it's the same active ingredient as one that's okay to use around seedlings, that it's okay, because it's really the surfactant often that matters.
Yep.
Whatever it's blended with, not so much the active herbicide itself.
Yeah. So a surfactant is what we call a sticker spreader, and that keeps the chemical on the target species longer is its point. And that alone can cause damage to seedlings just because it stays on the tree for so long.
Okay, can diseases be introduced from certain types of mulch?
I don't know what you're talking about for diseases. The root diseases, I would say no. Once they get ground up into mulch and exposed to the air, they're not much of a threat for spreading. I'm not sure about other foliar or fungal diseases. I'm not sure if you know anything about that, Kevin, but the root diseases certainly not.
Yeah, and I've only heard in terms of root disease, if root disease is a concern, we don't recommend tilling it into the soil because that could spread it. But as long as it's on the surface of the soil, it's not going to be an issue.
Yeah. So Carol's mentioning she heard that you can't walk away from new plantings for 5 years. So 5 years, I guess I'll give you a forester's answer. It all depends. The term that we use in the forestry world is free to grow. And what we are looking for is to ensure that our trees are going to stay above whatever the stressor is, whether that's animals, whether that's vegetation. And once we are sure that our trees are going to be able to outcompete that stressor, we consider our trees free to grow, and we can quote unquote walk away maybe until pre-commercial thinning. In reality, never really walk away. I always recommend at least a yearly walkthrough just to make sure nothing funky is going on. And so that could be maybe 3 years if you've done really good site prep and you're on a really good site. Um, when I worked in the Hood Canal State Forest, that was often 8 or 10 years because we had slow growing trees and a whole lot of brush.
Okay, for seedlings which are from natural reseeding, how should they be transplanted? Same as any farm stock or?
So I don't quite know what farm stock is, but what I would say is we transplant them during the dormant season. We try to get them when they are small, and we want to dig a large hole. So we dig them up, we don't pull them up. And we want to dig a large enough hole that we get the entire root mass out of the ground. So obviously, with a large tree, that's a lot of work. So normally, once they're past a few years old, it gets pretty difficult. But if you're able to do all that, you should be able to transplant them pretty well.
Okay, next one. We have some areas of Scotch broom where the only real option is to mow. Is this best left until late summer?
So actually, the Scotchroom Symposium I just went to a few weeks ago would say yes. There seems to be a lot of evidence that cutting or mowing Scotch broom in the late summer can cause it to not resprout. The trick is with your mowing is you can't leave any stobs of green vegetation. Normally people are cutting and they can make sure that they don't leave any green stems sticking up that can help it to regrow. But it probably will work. You're probably going to have a seed bed in there, so it's not that you're not going to have Scotch broom. It just might be the stuff that you cut isn't going to regrow. Um, so yeah, you could do it in the late summer. Really, with Scotch broom, it's a non-native. Um, Cutting it, I've heard right after it flowers before the seed pods come because its energy stores are at the lowest. And then I've heard recently with the symposium late summer. Um, just get rid of it. Scotch broom is nasty. It's allelopathic, so it puts down chemicals to stop new trees for new plants from growing. There's emerging evidence that the Scotch Brim Symposium said that it might alter long-term soil chemistry. They looked 30 years of at prairie restoration, and 30 years later, in places that had Scotch broom when they started the restoration, they still have a non-native plant community. It's not Scotch broom anymore; it's grasses. In areas where Scotch broom never existed, they've been able to restore native plant communities. So, if you have Scotch broom on your property, get rid of it somehow, some way. Scorched earth is my policy with Scotch broom.
And don't forget, everyone, on July 14th coming up, we have a webinar specifically on invasive species and best treatment options for a lot of specific species. So we don't need to get into all of the details of that here. We're going to be having Sasha Shaw coming from King County Noxious Weeds to talk about all of those different invasives.
Okay, next question is, what is the best way to remove or kill English ivy? We have some starting to creep in from the neighbor's property.
Well, it depends how much you have. Spraying can work, but it's got a real thick, waxy coating. So if you're going to spray, you have to use a surfactant so it stays on the leaf for as long as possible. What I've read with information on that is ivy is one of those things that does grow year round in the Pacific Northwest and the Western Washington in particular. So I've actually heard that you spray it in like December and you're not going to notice it dies till the following spring, but it usually does a pretty good job of killing it. You just got to wait till you have some temperatures over 50 degrees and it's not going to rain a while to make sure what you've done is acceptable. If it's a small patch, I would just pull it. It pulls really easy. That can just be time intensive if you have a lot. But if it's just starting to creep onto your neighbors, um, I would just keep pulling it off your property. Unless your neighbor controls it, I don't think spraying or anything else is really going to work. But it pulls really easy. It does. Those roots are not very deep.
One thing for sure not to do is mow it. So if you mow it, it fragments it, and then there's a whole lot more fibrous root mat there. It makes it very difficult to pull up.
Hmm.
Okay, next question. For a healthier forest for non-commercial harvest, is it good to mix and match tree species, or should species be planted in bunches?
Well, I will say this, that there's resiliency and diversity. Um, how you do it probably matters a little less. It's probably going to depend specifically on your site. For instance, if you have wet spots on your property, that's probably not going to be a good spot for Douglas fir. I think, Jeff, you are in eastern Washington, so for instance, ponderosa pine might not be down near that wetland, for instance. So depending on your site, you may have stuff bunched up in places. So I think getting a hold of Rob for you in particular, he might be able to come out and visit your site and give you some really good site-specific information on whether you should just intermix a few species or if you should put it in patches or bunches like you were saying. But there is resiliency and diversity. That's the take-home message. I always recommend a diversity of tree species.
Okay, what native trees are good for soil stabilization on hillsides and also are less likely to shed large branches and fall easily in a heavy rain? Are big leaf maples and Pacific willows a good choice?
I feel like maples would be okay. I don't know what you think, Kevin. I'm not sure about the willows. They're not very long-lived, and I don't know that they root very deep. I like madrone on steep slopes too. If it's dry, it's got a pretty decent tap root.
Yeah, I'd be a bit worried about the maple starting to shed large branches as it
Yeah,
gets
it
older.
would. You're right. Yep.
I'm looking something up here, hopefully get you a more definitive list here.
So the water table is very high and not dry, she said as well. So it's not good for madrone is if it's got a high water table. I would say if
Could
the
probably
water table's
still put
high,
some up at the very top of the slope.
potentially. And I would mention if the water table's high, Carly, that typically means you have shallow rooting depths because most trees don't like their feet being wet, and trees falling over may be a foregone conclusion on that site, regardless of what you do.
Yeah, it also probably means you have some clay lenses in there that are going to restrict root penetration even if there wasn't moisture.
Yep. So hazelnut is a pretty common tree in a lot of Western Washington. So the question was, any experience and thoughts about hazelnut? Um, I'm a big fan of hazelnut. I like to see it when I'm out in the woods. I've never actually seen a hazelnut on a hazelnut, and I think that's because the birds get to it first, which is one of the things I like about it. It's really good for wildlife. Um, Again, talking about reforestation, I don't typically consider hazelnut to be a tree. I consider it to be a shrub. And so it would be something I would potentially control because it's native. That doesn't necessarily mean kill, but it would mean maybe it gets mowed or cut back until my trees are going to stay above it. What planting advice would you give to a bunch of volunteers planting trees at a restoration site? So, the advice that I would give volunteers on a restoration site is that it's not a race. Um, when we're planting for production in forestry, those crews go fast. And if you have volunteers that haven't planted a lot of trees, I would bring that slide that I showed all the ways to plant a tree poorly and the one way to plant a tree correctly, and make sure that they're familiar with that and make sure that they're taking the time to plant the tree correctly. And if that means that they're not going to get a tree in the ground every 15 to 30 seconds like the pros do, that's okay, right? Because with those restoration sites, if it's volunteers, if it's with a land trust or a conservation group, money's tight. We don't want to have to plant trees multiple times. Let's just make sure it's done right the first time and take a little bit of time to do it. Kevin's still looking something up for you, I think, Carly, as well. So don't go away just yet. I think he was looking up some information for you.
Kevin, were you looking for that fact page from Greenbelt?
That was one of them. It didn't have what I was looking for
Okay.
exactly. So I'm looking at another one right now.
I also have a sheet. It might be the same one you guys have. That's called Native Plants for Erosion Control. So you could shoot me an email, Carly, and I could send that to you as well. That's not just trees, that's shrubs and everything else.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm looking here, and I'm just not finding it in my files.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have access to it right now because I'm not on the DNR network, but I do have it. So I can shoot that to you, Carly, if you just shoot me an email. Looks like I'm going to see hazelnuts here in a few weeks when I go out on the Whitlock's property, and I'm going to see trees. That's going to be exciting. Yeah, I think that's probably what I have right there, Carly, that native plants for erosion control. Yep, and this is what I was going to send you, Carly. I just opened that up.
Works for me. Okay, I think we've exhausted all the questions. So with that, thank you again, Matt. And we will bid all of you a very pleasant rest of your evening. There's still a little daylight left. And we hope to see you again at one of our other upcoming webinars. We've still got a few coming up, as well as there's going to be a fire one tomorrow, I believe.
Yep, Patrick's doing a fire one. I'll be involved with that to some degree. I'm not a speaker tomorrow, but you're going to have two really good speakers tomorrow if you listen in on that.
Yep, indeed. Okay, folks.
Everyone have a good evening.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody.